Before I start my digital story, I wanted to give a short land acknowledgement for the land that I live on in Toronto and where I go to school at Western. Although land acknowledgements do not fix the injustices Indigenous peoples in Canada have endured, it starts a conversation to lead to a more educated Canada. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lunawapik, and the Attawandaron peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards on the land and vital contributors to our society. My immediate family consists of my brother Henry, my mom, my dad, and myself. My parents were both raised Catholic but abandoned their religion and most practices when they were teens and decided to raise their kids atheist. My father, my brother, and myself are atheists, but my mom, however, is not. We do not celebrate any German or Lithuanian holidays or cultural practices, but we do eat food from both backgrounds as well as Korean. My dad was born in the suburbs of Toronto to two Lithuanian immigrants who fled the Soviets during the war. My father grew up speaking Lithuanian at home and going to Lithuanian church, playing in a Lithuanian basketball league, and even spending his summers as a Lithuanian scout. Lithuanian culture is similar to Eastern European cultures where meat and potatoes are very big in their culture, as well as big family Sunday dinners. My mother was born to a German immigrant mother and a Serbian immigrant father on a fruit farm in Grimsby, Ontario, about an hour away from Toronto. She grew up pretty poor on a farm and eventually moved to Toronto for her education and eventually met my dad. My brother Henry is currently 18. He's 3 years younger than me and he is from South Korea. My family adopted him when he was 8 months old, and I was about 4 years old when the first time I got to meet him at the Toronto airport. I always feel weird saying he's adopted because to me that means nothing. He's been my brother as long as I can remember. Although we are not religious, we celebrate Christmas and Easter mainly for the part of family gatherings. I don't believe in Thanksgiving, and neither does my brother and my father. Some of our family values that may be different compared to other families is the way that we incorporate Korean culture and values into our lives in order to give Henry a part of his heritage. Growing up, every summer we would attend something called Korean Culture Camp. This is a summer camp for families who've had young adoptive Korean children in their family. Newly immigrated Koreans in Toronto ran the organization and annual camps. In addition to Henry being able to play with other adopted Korean children, eat Korean food, and participate in Korean cultural activities, these cultural camps were a huge part of my values and the way that I perceive other cultures. Without Henry, my parents and I would never be as educated as we are today when it comes to Korean cultural values and celebrations. Henry just wasn't an addition to our family, but gave us an additional culture to celebrate and share with him. For me, parts of Indigenous knowledge that I understand and strive to keep in my life are the respect for the earth, water, and natural resources the earth gives us. Like we have heard throughout our lectures and discussions, Indigenous knowledge to me is the caring relationships Indigenous peoples have with the earth and everything it gives us naturally. The relationship between land and Indigenous communities is important and something the world could learn from, especially in times of climate change. To me, Indigenous knowledge is acknowledging the matriarchal in terms of clan mothers and respect that comes with the title and role. Indigenous knowledge to me is having heard your elders tell your stories face to face, orally about your ancestors and how your community used to live. In terms of worldviews, and even Indigenous knowledge right now, I know and understand that the fight for Indigenous rights and right to Indigenous knowledge is constantly up for debate. In relation, I have a good understanding of UNDRIP. I've been studying UNDRIP and its various articles for years now, and my understanding is that every country should adopt UNDRIP and implement their policies. Although the current government has done more than the past federal government has in terms of implementing UNDRIP articles for Indigenous rights in Canada's, there is still more Canada can do. Lastly, this graphic I was able to find shows many aspects of Indigenous knowledge I respect, understand, and try to incorporate into my everyday life and their values, such as identity, reconciliation, policy, acknowledgements, and learning from the land. This graphic was able to show me sections such as teachings, languages, and treaties are sections that I lack in terms of Indigenous knowledge and where I can try and learn more and educate myself. Although Indigenous knowledge is more present than I would think compared to my non Indigenous friends and their families, it is still lacking and could be improved in my family, our beliefs, and our values in many ways. My father is the most educated and well versed when it comes to Canadian Indigenous cultural practices and understanding Indigenous knowledge. My father's an environmentalist, and again, he works with Indigenous leaders, communities, and other environmentalists. My father and my mother and I are all educated when it comes to indigenous training in terms of like government practices, but again, I would think that myself and my dad were more educated than my mom, as we have more of experience working with indigenous communities in terms of research. The only solid practice of Indigenous knowledge that our family continues to do is our respect for the environment and the amount of effort and our time our family puts into doing our part to combat climate change. Indigenous knowledge is strongest in my family when it comes to environmental endeavors. More than anything, my family is more aware than most non Indigenous people of what Indigenous knowledge, culture, and practices are, but we are lacking the actual action of including these into our everyday lives. When it comes to the relevance of Indigenous knowledge in relation to treaties and what it means to engage ethically with Indigenous knowledge when it comes to research, my father and I have both worked with Indigenous academics when it comes to ethical research. A part of my minor allowed me to take a course last year with the other Professor Lewis in Indigenous Studies at Western, where we learned how to conduct research with Indigenous communities ethically. I was able to conduct a policy paper at the end of the year with my group on improving Indigenous student experience at Western with the research we gathered from current and past students, professors, and Indigenous leaders in the Western community. My father works with various Indigenous based environmental groups, but I believe he has no formal training. All in all, one of the sections I lack information and awareness on are Indigenous treaties. I only started to learn about treaties at university and was able to quickly realize that we don't discuss them, usually as the Canadian government has taken advantage of Indigenous land in most treaty cases. I'm hoping that I'll be able to learn more about treaties and how, as someone who's non Indigenous, can support Indigenous communities in treaty issues with the Canadian government.